Hi guys, I'm Amber Coles and I had chapter 11, which was cinema technologies. I will be going through the PowerPoint slide with you all and elaborating on each of these points to make my transitions a little easier for you all to follow. So on the first slide, we have the beginning, and we have two of our different film cameras. Before then, we had advances in photography, with Kodak making a lot of strides in photography, as well as film strips and film rolls and things of that nature. So it started to be a thing where humans are always evolving, and so we're thinking of how we can take these still photographs and make them into moving pictures. And so we had the kinetograph and the cinematograph. Dixon, who was of the Edison Labs in 1890, invented the kinetograph. I'm sorry, the kinetograph, and it basically is like the flip book. And so, if you've ever made a flip book, you know that you have basically like a stack of sheets of paper, usually like a little notebook, and you basically draw a character or a sequence, and each different page has a slightly different um, variation to the sequence, whether it's an arm is raised or you're progressively having the character move off the page and move back on with like a hat on or something to that effect. So that's what the kinetograph basically did. It was basically a motion flip book. Then you had the Lumiere brothers who had the cinematograph, and theirs basically had a hand crank on the side, and so instead of it spinning um, in an upright circular position, and so you had those two in the 1800s, obviously compared to our 3D cameras and our high definition cameras at this point, they seem ancient because of the stiltedness of it and kind of like the elementary nature of it, because obviously it's the 1800s, and so they didn't necessarily have the technology at the time um, to really make them lifelike. And so the first minute film is called The Cabbage Fairy. If you've read the chapter, then you know it's an actual name in French, but I don't speak French, so I'm not going to butcher these names. We also have our first publicly projected film, which is also in French, which I'm not going to butcher and pronounce, but it is on my PowerPoint slide. Then you have W.D. Griffith, who is deemed the father of the modern narrative form. So you have photography and advances in photography, and then you actually get the moving picture, and now you want to put a story with the moving picture. And so he had the Great Train Robbery in 1903, and then a lot of the silent films came to be. And then later on, you have the Mitchell Camera Corporation starting making the standard 35 millimeter camera, which is what everybody started to shoot on until the 1950s when Panavision came in, and we evolved from there. Then you have the film studios. So you had the Ellison Laboratories, where earlier Dickinson, who created the kinetograph, was from. They invented their Black Maria, which is the world's first film studio. And then later on, you have film studios who emerged. So you had MGM, Metro Goldwyn and Mayer. An interesting fact is Tony Goldwyn, who is the president on Scandal. I believe this is like one of his family members' great great grandpa or something to the effect, was actually the Goldwyn in Metro Goldwyn and Mayer. Fox, Paramount, and Warner Brothers. So they were the big companies, and they kind of created a monopoly within the four because they included they had production, distribution, and exhibition. So they controlled all of that. And then you had Universal, United Artists, and Columbia, which were minor studios. So they weren't necessarily on the same level. They didn't monopolize it as the other four had. And then you have 1922, the Motion Picture Producers and Directors of America was formed, and they introduced the Hays Production Code, which we'll talk about later, which led into the MPAA, which we still use today to regulate restrictions and ratings on movies. And then you have 1927. So again, we have photography, and then you have the moving picture. You've now added the narrative. Now it's time to add sound. And so The Jazz Singer, which was a film that was released in 1927, was our first talkie. And it was basically words being synchronized with the motion on the camera. Whereas before, as we all have seen, silent films. These silent films would basically have the action, and there would be a pause that would explain what was going on, some more sequence of action, and then the next one would be basically written dialogue, and that's how you have to keep up. And now we've introduced sound, and so now we can create what are called talkies. So later we get into these film aspect ratios, which are kind of like fun facts in a way. 4:3 standard definition TVs. I think us all have moved into the high definition stage, and so we all have 16:9 televisions probably. And then you have the European standard for theaters, as well as there's some other aspect ratios in our book that deal with a lot of the new ratios for film and things of that nature. And then we come to my next slide, which is Hollywood. Um, Obviously, before, films are a new um, creative way to express yourself. And so, obviously, at some point, the U.S. Supreme Court has to get involved. And so, in 1952, there was a ruling that said that movies and films were protected under the Constitution under the First and Fourth Amendment. And so, remember earlier, I was telling you about the MPBDA enforcing the Hays Production Code, and that's on this slide, which basically regulated things such as nudity, profane language, other obscene things that might be involved in movies. So although they were protected under the Supreme Court law, the First and Fourth, obviously the Bill of Rights, and said they had the freedom of speech, there were some regulations that were put in place based on the Producers and Directors Association. And then later on, it was replaced by the MPAA, which we still use today, which you see when you first start watching whatever movie you're going to see. That was initiated in 1968, but it's been revised, I think, at least 2 or 3 times, and now we have our standard now. So then we get into 3D cinema. And along with us advancing into 3D cameras, we also advanced, our sound became more sophisticated. So we now have Dolby and THX and surround sound. And so you got more sophisticated lifelike sound, and then you get more sophisticated lifelike movement on camera. And so 3D cameras, for all of the sophisticated scholars that are here, you guys probably remember going to the movie theaters if you're like an 80s or 70s baby, where they had 3D movies and the 3D glasses in like the 80s for like Back to the Future and movies like that. I remember my mom went with the, the blue lens and the red lens and stuff like that. And so now we have different 3D glasses that are like sunglasses, and you go to the movies and you see the things pop out at you. Now, I'm not really sure how it worked in the 80s, but how we got to 3D cinema films is celluloid, which was basically used in the film strips that you would make the movies with, slowly became obsolete. And at the same time it was becoming obsolete, the cost of it was going up because the need for silver. Silver was an important material for the celluloid. And so luckily we entered the digital age where we didn't necessarily need film, but we could save it on hard drives and discs and flash drives and things of that nature, as well as there became more sophisticated editing equipment that you've also read in our book. They even mentioned Final Cut Pro as being one of the formats in which you can edit films, which is really fun to know that since I have a Mac personally, to know that you can edit like full-length films on something as simple as getting like Final Cut Pro. So first we have films like I've mentioned here, Alice in Wonderland and Avatar, that shows just how profitable and how fluid, and by fluid I mean as far as the motion, as far as the sound, everything seeming real lifelike and as of real life. They just showed, so again, profitable and fluid these 3D flips could be. And then we have more advancements as far, for example, The Hobbit, which is my mom's like favorite film, and Lord of the Rings, 2 separate films, but they kind of come from the same storyline. In Lord of the Rings, if you remember, the creature Gollum was technically part human and part CGI. The actor whose voice and mannerisms you see, and more or less his body, that you see on film, actually he had on a suit that I believe was on a green screen, but he had a blue suit with different like sensor balls on him that would pick up his motion and his mannerisms. So everything you see in the film is actually him acting, method acting as they call it, being Gollum. You hear his voice, but it's just CGI over his body, using those balls and things of that nature. And then you have Toy Story and a lot of the Disney movies getting more sophisticated. And just to clarify, the difference between 2D and 3D is 2D is basically kind of like this video we're shooting for our presentations. It's just straight on, one dimension from one angle. Whereas 3D, if you're making a movie in 3D, you have to have cameras at all different angles, because in order for example, I went to see Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 3D, and it was a part where there was a hatchet being thrown, and in order for us to see, the dimension of the hatchet, it had to be filmed at, obviously film being thrown and filmed at, various angles. And so that's the 3D. And there are a lot more advancements, which leads to my question. There are a lot of trends, including 3D for cinema, but there's like clothes and different fashions and different music and a lot of trends that were popular back in the 80s and the 90s and the 50s that come back all the time. As we know, we recycle things all of the time. So what do you think is the next trend in cinema? Is it 4K? Is it 4D? Is it making 3D the standard for all films? So what do you think is the next trend in cinema? I personally think at some point we're just going to have strictly videos in 3D, although films like Nebraska and 12 Years a Slave and a lot of Quentin Tarantino films, I know especially Quentin Tarantino, loves films that are shot on 35 millimeter film. He likes to cut them. He likes the authenticity of the older cameras. He doesn't use too much digital. And there's a lot of people, like I mentioned, Nebraska and 12 Years a Slave, that don't necessarily like the digital nature of film and how that's going. But at some point, we'll always have nostalgia, but at some point we're going to have to come into the digital age because everything is becoming technology based. So again, what do you think is the next trend in cinema? Hopefully I've given you more information than you needed in this presentation. And if anybody has any questions, any comments or concerns, I can't wait to read your comments and see whether you liked it or whether you hated it. Thanks, guys.